In 1941, the Japanese Empire stood at the height of its power. Its military had conquered vast portions of China. Its navy was among the strongest in the world, and its leaders believed destiny favored bold action. Yet hidden behind confident speeches and imperial ambition was a simple but devastating miscalculation, a fatal mathematical error that would ultimately doom Japan's war effort. This was not merely a mistake in arithmetic, but a profound misjudgment of industrial capacity, time, and national endurance. Japanese strategists believed that if they struck fast and hard enough, the United States would lack the will to fight a long war. They calculated America's response in terms of morale and short-term shock. What they failed to calculate correctly was production power. They assumed that destroying part of the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor would neutralize American strength for years. Instead, they awakened a giant whose factories could outproduce the entire Japanese industrial base several times over. This miscalculation would set the stage for every defeat that followed, from Midway to the Philippines. In the cold language of numbers, Japan bet its empire on a short war. The math, however, was never on their side. The roots of the fatal error lay in Japan's understanding of American society. Japanese planners studied the United States and concluded it was divided, isolationist, and unwilling to sustain heavy casualties. They looked at America's reluctance to enter World War I, and assumed history would repeat itself. But they underestimated a critical variable: industrial mobilization. In 1940, the United States already produced more steel than Japan, Germany, and Italy combined. American oil production dwarfed Japan's almost entirely imported supply. Yet Japanese calculations focused on naval tonnage in the Pacific at that moment, not on shipyards capable of replacing losses at astonishing speed. Their models predicted America would negotiate within 2 years if struck decisively. The assumption ignored the exponential effect of American manufacturing once fully mobilized. Japan had limited access to raw materials, limited oil reserves, and limited industrial capacity. The United States had abundance in all three categories. By focusing on immediate military strength instead of long-term production ratios, Japanese leaders committed an error of projection. They calculated a snapshot, not a trend. In war, trends determine survival. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, actually understood the imbalance. He famously warned that Japan could run wild for 6 months, but could not guarantee victory beyond that. His statement was not poetic, it was mathematical. He knew American shipbuilding capacity would outpace Japan dramatically. Yet political pressure and strategic necessity forced Japan's hand. Oil embargoes imposed by the United States threatened to strangle Japan's military machine within months. Facing dwindling reserves, Japanese leadership believed waiting meant slow defeat. They calculated that seizing Southeast Asia's oil fields would solve the problem. However, even this was flawed math. Securing oil fields required protecting long supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean. Every tanker, every escort ship, every aircraft required fuel, creating a consumption cycle Japan could barely sustain. Meanwhile, American industry could replace ships faster than Japan could sink them. The numbers were merciless. Japan built roughly 10 aircraft carriers during the war. America built more than 20 fleet carriers, and over 100 escort carriers. Production mathematics, not battlefield bravery, determined the outcome. The attack on Pearl Harbor itself reveals the fatal miscalculation. Japanese planners counted battleships destroyed and assumed strategic advantage, but they overlooked America's aircraft carriers, which were absent from the harbor that day. More importantly, they failed to destroy oil storage facilities, submarine bases, and repair yards. These were the true logistical heart of Pacific operations. Japan calculated tactical damage, America calculated strategic recovery. Within months, U.S. shipyards began launching new vessels at unprecedented rates. The Liberty ship program alone produced thousands of cargo ships. American factories shifted from cars and refrigerators to tanks and bombers almost overnight. Japan's industrial base, constrained by resources and bombing vulnerability, could not compete. The fatal math error was not that Pearl Harbor failed tactically. It succeeded in shocking the United States. The error was assuming shock equals surrender. Instead, shock triggered mobilization. Every sunken American battleship became a rallying cry. Every lost sailor strengthened public resolve. The equation Japan relied upon, fear plus damage equals negotiation, turned into anger plus production equals total war. By mid-1942, the consequences of the miscalculation began to surface at the Battle of Midway. Japan entered the battle with 4 frontline aircraft carriers, believing they still held numerical superiority. American codebreakers, however, had deciphered Japanese plans. When U.S. dive bombers destroyed 4 Japanese carriers in a single day, Japan lost not just ships but irreplaceable trained pilots. This exposed another flaw in Japanese mathematics: training pipelines. American pilot training programs expanded rapidly, producing thousands of aviators annually. Japan's program remained small and elite, unable to replace losses quickly. War is not only about hardware, but also human capital. The United States could replace planes and pilots simultaneously. Japan could replace neither at scale. Midway marked the turning point, because the industrial curve had already begun to tilt irreversibly toward America. From that point onward, Japan fought a defensive war against an enemy whose output doubled and tripled yearly. The fatal error of 1941 echoed in every subsequent defeat. The initial gamble assumed a short conflict. Instead, Japan faced a marathon it was mathematically incapable of finishing. Oil represented the clearest numerical disadvantage. Before the war, Japan imported roughly 80% of its oil, much of it from the United States. When the embargo hit, Japan had reserves estimated to last about 18 months under wartime consumption. Their calculation was simple: seize the Dutch East Indies oil fields and secure independence from Western pressure. But securing oil and transporting it safely are entirely different equations. American submarines targeted Japanese tankers with devastating efficiency. By 1944, U.S. submarines had sunk the majority of Japan's merchant fleet. Oil production in captured territories could not compensate for transport losses. Japanese ships often remained docked due to fuel shortages. Pilots trained with minimal flight hours to conserve gasoline. Tanks were used sparingly. Meanwhile, American forces operated with near-limitless supply. The United States produced more oil than all other major powers combined. Logistics, the mathematics of movement, turned against Japan. An empire dependent on maritime supply could not survive when its shipping lanes were systematically destroyed. Numbers once again dictated destiny. Another overlooked variable was economic scalability. The United States converted civilian industry into military production at breathtaking speed. Automobile factories produced bombers. Typewriter companies manufactured rifles. By 1944, America produced nearly 100,000 aircraft in a single year. Japan's peak production never approached such figures. Even when Japanese engineers designed advanced aircraft like the Zero fighter, quantity could not match quality losses. The American strategy became one of overwhelming force: more planes, more ships, more ammunition. This approach recognized a simple truth: industrial warfare rewards volume. Japan's fatal math error was believing superior training and spirit could compensate for inferior output. While bravery and discipline are powerful assets, they cannot replace fuel, steel, and replacement parts. The Pacific War evolved into a battle of attrition, and attrition is governed by arithmetic. The side that replaces losses faster wins. By late 1943, the replacement ratio overwhelmingly favored the United States. Japan was losing the numbers game on every front. Time itself became a mathematical enemy. Japanese leadership hoped for a decisive engagement that would shatter American morale. Instead, each passing month strengthened U.S. capacity. American GDP doubled during the war. War bonds financed expansion. Women entered factories in massive numbers. The population united behind a single objective. Japan, under constant strain, struggled with resource allocation. Civilian shortages increased. Infrastructure deteriorated. Strategic bombing campaigns further reduced production capacity. The longer the war lasted, the wider the gap became. Japan's initial calculation assumed a war measured in months. The reality extended into years. Every additional year multiplied American advantage. By 1945, the disparity in naval power was overwhelming. The U.S. Navy fielded dozens of carriers and hundreds of destroyers. Japan could barely fuel the ships it had left. The fatal error of 1941 was not corrected because it could not be company-rected. The numbers were locked in motion, and they moved only in one direction. Psychology also entered the equation. Japanese leaders believed American society, perceived as materialistic and comfort-driven, would not tolerate prolonged hardship. This was a misreading of democratic resilience. The attack on Pearl Harbor unified public opinion almost instantly. Recruitment surged, industrial workers embraced long shifts, scientific communities accelerated weapons development, including radar and eventually the atomic bomb. Japan's calculation underestimated the multiplier effect of national unity. In mathematical terms, morale acted as a force multiplier for production. Instead of fracturing, America consolidated. Meanwhile, Japan faced growing internal strain as casualties mounted and shortages intensified. The empire's confidence in swift victory eroded. When expectations are based on flawed projections, morale suffers as reality contradicts assumptions. The psychological miscalculation compounded the industrial one. Japan expected surrender, it received total mobilization. The error was not simply numerical, it was strategic blindness to how societies respond under attack. By 1944, the imbalance reached catastrophic proportions for Japan. American shipyards launched a new aircraft carrier nearly every month. Advanced technologies like improved radar and code-breaking enhanced battlefield effectiveness. Japan's remaining experienced pilots dwindled. Fuel scarcity limited training. The once dominant Imperial Navy retreated. American forces adopted an island-hopping strategy, bypassing heavily fortified positions and isolating them. This approach maximized efficiency. Another mathematical advantage. Instead of costly frontal assaults everywhere, the U.S. targeted strategic nodes. Each captured island brought bombers closer to the Japanese mainland. The attritional curve steepened dramatically. The Japanese leadership's 1941 calculation assumed parity long enough to negotiate from strength. By 1944, parity was unimaginable. The numbers had spiraled beyond recovery. What began as a bold gamble had become an unwinnable equation. The culmination of the fatal math error appeared in 1945. American B-29 bombers devastated Japanese cities. Industrial output collapsed under relentless bombing. Naval blockades starved the home islands of food and fuel. Japan's capacity to resist shrank daily. Even kamikaze tactics, desperate measures born of dwindling resources, could not reverse the trend. The introduction of atomic weapons ended the war abruptly, but Japan's defeat was already mathematically certain long before Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The empire had been fighting against an exponential curve it could never surpass. The decision in 1941 to provoke a war with a nation possessing quadruple its industrial capacity sealed its fate. The error was embedded in the very premise of the conflict. In hindsight, historians debate whether Japan had any viable alternative. Economic sanctions left few choices. Yet the decision-makers in Tokyo believed speed could overcome scale. They miscalculated how quickly America could convert potential into reality. Industrial capacity is like a dormant engine. Once activated, it produces compounding returns. Japan's war planning underestimated compounding growth. That was the mathematical flaw at the heart of the empire's downfall. They planned for linear outcomes in an exponential world. Numbers do not bend to courage or ideology. Japan's soldiers and sailors displayed extraordinary determination throughout the Pacific War. However, valor cannot refill empty fuel tanks, or rebuild destroyed fleets instantly. American industry operated like a vast equation balancing losses with replacements. When Japan lost a carrier, replacing it took years. When America lost one, another was already under construction. The asymmetry widened relentlessly. The fatal error was not ignorance of America's size but disbelief in its mobilization speed. That disbelief proved catastrophic. The lessons of 1941 extend beyond World War II. Strategic planning requires understanding not just current strength, but growth potential. Japan assessed visible forces and ignored hidden capacity. They calculated ships afloat, not ships building. They measured present oil stocks, not sustainable supply chains. In modern terms, they underestimated scalability and overestimated shock value. This miscalculation transformed a regional power into a nation fighting for survival within 4 years. The Pacific War demonstrates that wars of attrition are governed by production curves. Once the curve tilts decisively, reversal becomes nearly impossible. Ultimately, the fatal math error of 1941 was the belief that willpower could substitute for arithmetic. Japan gambled on a short war against a nation designed for long wars. The attack on Pearl Harbor achieved tactical surprise but triggered strategic disaster. From shipbuilding rates to oil production, from pilot training numbers to GDP growth, every measurable indicator favored the United States. Once mobilized, the empire that sought dominance in Asia found itself crushed beneath the weight of industrial mathematics. In war, bravery matters, leadership matters, strategy matters. But underlying everything is math: production totals, supply ratios, replacement rates, and time. In 1941, Japan miscalculated those numbers, and that single, fatal error set the course for the empire's inevitable collapse.